I'd like to introduce Fiona McKenzie now, who's the Policy Director at the Australian Futures Project, which is hosted at La Trobe University in Victoria. The mission of the Australian Futures Project is to build Australia's collective capacity to make decisions for a flourishing shared future in the 2020s and 2030s. Fiona also works as an independent advisor on agricultural and environmental policy. In this capacity, she recently completed a project with Eco-Agriculture Partners and the United Nations Environment Programme. This program focused on enabling cross-sectorial collaboration in the global food system. The project culminated in a 3-day retreat in 2013 with representatives from the UN agencies and from government, business, non-government and academia from around the world. Previously, Fiona was part of a team that established the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists in Australia and the Terrestrial Carbon Group International. That's a real mouthful. I'm really struggling with your bio. Her presentation is called Improving Future Decision Making in Australia, Strategies for Change. Would you please welcome Fiona?
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I think this talk will be a little bit different because I can quite confidently say I probably know the least about early childhood development of anyone in this room. So, okay, there might be one other person. We can talk at lunch. What I'm really going to talk about is a slightly different project that is very much focused at a national level, but it's really taking this idea of thinking in systems. And so what I want to do is just explain a little bit about our project and what we're doing, and hopefully it'll make sense, and if it doesn't, I'll be around at lunchtime, so pull me up for a chat. So firstly, the Australian Futures Project, it basically started with an idea, which was, imagine if you could do something to help improve Australia's democracy. And from that, we actually reverted back to a question. So a colleague, Ralph Ashton, and I started talking about this in 2011, and our question was, and when we went and asked people this, we thought maybe we're just imagining this, but is there something wrong with Australia's decision making at the moment, particularly in regards to long-term issues? Does anyone agree that maybe there's a problem? Yeah. Show of hands. Is it different, do you think, maybe from what it might have been 30 years ago, the way the system works now? And then the other questions we had for people were, if it is different, why is it different, and what can we do about it? And so we actually spent, I'd say about 12 months talking to all sorts of people in leadership positions around Australia, particularly in ex-politicians and current politicians, and basically asking these questions, going, surely there is something that can be done. And most people said, yes, there's a problem, no idea what you can do to fix it, that's just life. And we were like, well, we want to give it a crack. So we basically decided to design a project that was true to the idea of a system. So before I get into that, I want to just talk about what actually is a system. So, this has gone the wrong way. Firstly, I don't want to make it complicated. The world's full of systems. I think a lot of it's very intuitive, and that's just the way the world works. So it's not rocket science in a lot of ways, and you can call it all sorts of things, but really a lot of it's just common sense. So in two simple ways to think about it. One is a rock and one is a bird, and some of you might have heard this analogy before, and I'm actually borrowing it from someone else, but the basic principle is if you threw a rock, something's going to happen. If you throw a bird, something else is going to happen. If you throw a rock, it's got you can pretty much determine the trajectory it's going to take, the behaviour it's going to have. It's not going to change on you halfway through. If you throw a bird, you've got no idea where it's going to go. You probably shouldn't have thrown it in the first place. But the way you might treat that, the way you might want to get the bird to get where you want it to go at the end might be through incentives, it might be through birdseed, it might be through all sorts of different things. So it's really just a basic idea to say that systems have different types of characteristics. The bird really represents what I think most of us are working with, which is something that we can't control. We don't necessarily have control of, and the way we might work with it, it's not, we can't just throw this rock and go, right, that's our plan. So if we can't do that, what does that mean for the way we're working? So a couple of basic principles. A complex system, so the idea of this bird, this living thing, it's basically really about the interactions in the system. So when we're working, if you're working in early childhood and other things, that a lot of the system, the complexity comes from the way the actors, the way the institutions, the way the structures in the system interact. And yet a lot of our processes are set up to deal with one institution or to document an outcome. It's not really set up to deal with those interactions. The other thing that often happens in complex systems is this counterintuitive or perverse outcome. So you try and fix one part of the system, before you know it, it's caused a problem over here, or it's dealt with something over here that's not what you thought was going to happen. So, and I imagine we've all come across this, and it's the same when you look at, sometimes when you look at political responses and you're like, they're responding to an event that doesn't reflect the system. And so people who know the system go, that's crazy. But for someone who just saw the event, that seemed logical at the time. So intuitively, I think we understand that. The other thing too, I think the advantage of complexity, the good thing about complexity is it's very resilient. So when you try and change a system, it can very much fight back at you, which is actually a good thing in some ways. I mean, imagine if every change you made worked and you looked back and went, oh, that wasn't the best idea. You know, I always think, this is a really bad one, but I always think, you know, the world shouldn't be made by one person, and I always think Canberra's a good example of that. It's like, you don't, the complexity and the things that, the resilience that comes with everybody having a play in it, it's got that resilience. Understanding where that resilience comes from, where that resistance comes from, can be really important, and understanding where you can actually leverage in the system to make change or get it to a threshold point where you can sort of perpetuate change. So I think in the context of Australia's decision-making system, we've taken the liberty of creating a very crass and simple diagram, which we use to get people talking and thinking about these interactions. So this is Australia in sort of one slide. We were basically saying that the emphasis for us is not on the structures, it's not on necessarily government, citizens, experts either. It's on these lines in between. And when you start talking about the lines in between, in any context, that's when you really start having the breakthrough moments in what is actually going on in this system. And we had, for example, an event, we got the Governor-General to host for us an event at Government House, and we had various senior ex-heads of different departments and things fighting over the lines and how thick they should be with coloured crayons. And they were like, you know, it's a really good tool. And so a lot of this, again, it's just tools for thinking about how do we get to that intangible stuff? How do we get to all the processes, the social norms, the things that are happening that are not going to turn up in a work plan necessarily, they're not going to turn up in some sort of target, the 15% or whatever you're aiming for. What are the things that are actually driving what's going on? So this is where, for the Australian Futures Project, we specifically said our goal is not just to set up another institution or another structure. We want to really focus on those lines. So that's what we're working on. In terms of kind of the so what, so again we thought about, and originally I have to say we were sitting there drawing out our work plan and what our strategy might be, and I was like, we're just falling back into the same way of doing things. We're still coming up with a strategy, we're coming up with a nice timeline, we're coming up with this prediction of where we're going to be in 3 years. We're like, if we're actually recognising we're working in a system, then our whole project has to be true to that. So we actually designed, and basically it's our logo as well now, it's a 4-step process, which is really just an iterative loop. So we basically gave ourselves permission to not know what we're doing and make mistakes and then fix it later. So that's pretty much our whole approach. So when everyone asks us, what's your outcomes, what's your vision, we don't have one necessarily. It's not our problem. We're about talking to other people and saying, what can we try and do? What can we experiment with? Are there interventions we could do? Let's give them a go. And let's start small, let's prototype, let's pilot them and see where they go and let's adapt. So our whole project's been like basically designed to follow that process. So I think in just the point I'd emphasise there probably is the rapid prototyping and the testing. So what we really are focusing on here is the idea. I think you can spend a lot of time on vision and a lot of time on what's the goal we want to get to, but you can design a perfect goal. It's like, where do you want the bird to fly to? But why don't you let the bird go and see where it goes? So I think just coming back to that, really, if you're interested in it, I can point you to a policy brief that I wrote recently, but it's on our website. But it's really just about the idea of experimentation and failure. And just imagine if the minister you're reporting to or the organisation you're reporting to, imagine if your CEO got up and said, I've got no idea and we'll probably fail. Even imagine if you did that. Our whole society is organised around the fact that we pretend we know what we're doing and we're not allowed to be wrong. And so therefore we're not allowed to learn because we're not allowed to admit we were wrong or to actually learn from that. So this whole idea is we're really about getting people comfortable with the idea of failure. And an example, Finland actually had a whole bunch of entrepreneurs there organised a National Failure Day. This whole idea that it's okay to be experimental. And then a lot of design theory, and engineers get this when they do little prototypes. They don't go and build a fancy car straight away. They'll build little matchbox cars, and they'll do this. It's an iterative loop. So I think within social change as well, we've got to give ourselves permission not to come up with grand manifestos, but actually experiment as we go. I think that all being said, reality is you have to raise money and you have to be funded, and it's hard to tell people that you're not outcomes focused, but I think we're slowly getting people. It takes more work, and I think it also comes to trust as well. We have to build a lot of personal relationships and spend a lot of time with people to explain to them what this process is, and there actually is a bit of science and thinking behind it, and that if you bring people into a process without a predetermined agenda, you're actually probably ironically more likely to get a better outcome anyway. So it's a lot of that is around trust. I think there's a couple of other things that I think I'd like to point out. One is if you recognise you're in a complex adaptive system, there's different ways to lead, and I think Sam alluded to some of these earlier as well, but the idea of the hero leader, this idea of the individual leader, if you look at, if you look at most people, I don't know, you can think of any leader, there are always people behind them, and I think the leader themselves needs to know that. And I think you find people get in trouble as soon as they think they can be the hero and go out in a system and go, I am right and this is my answer and da-da-da. And I think people end up looking a bit like dinosaurs when they do that these days, in the sense of it's a very old school style of leadership, whereas the idea of the leader as host is that whole sense of humility and the sense of, I think I read a good thing which was the smartest person in the room is the room, in the sense that it's the thing bringing everyone together, because everyone in the room's got something to offer. So it's really that humility. It's recognising that the system is resilient. So how do you make advantage of that resilience? How do you build that resilience? At the same time, how do you incentivise change, or how do you get to transformation? And then as the system evolves, how do you recalibrate? How do you get yourself in a situation where you're not stuck? You haven't tied yourself to a set of answers that you actually have to turn around and say are wrong. How do you set yourself up to go, that failure was actually a success because we learnt from it and we're going to try again. So I think these are all things that are quite important. And I think lastly, there's a difference between management authority and leadership. Just because you're senior doesn't mean you're a leader, and it doesn't mean you should be either. Your job as a senior person might actually be to promote leadership on the ground. So leadership should be able to arise anywhere in a complex adaptive system. That's one of the great things about it. So I think, yeah, there were sort of some of the key concepts I wanted to get across. I think in terms of, there were a couple of other questions that I was meant to answer. One was, I think, around the shining lights, or who's shown leadership. And it's actually really hard to think of individuals, and I think this comes back to the idea of hero versus host. And the people that I can think of, all the people that I can think of that I would say are shining lights, are probably no one's ever heard of them. And that's because they're so good at what they do. So, there's been great facilitators and people who get people who bring that room together. And what Tanya and others of her team has done today, that is the shining light for me. It's not the heroic person. And then I think there was another question which I probably should have started with, but I'm going to finish with, which is what drives me to do this work. And I think, as Diane mentioned, my background actually is in agriculture, and I've done work at the sort of the farmer level in Australia, in Indonesia. I've worked at the UN level on sort of particularly around climate change. I've worked at New South Wales government level on various different things. And I think for me, the thing that's always come back is that it doesn't matter how good your evidence is, it doesn't matter how good your plan is, there are other things driving decision making. And it is, I think for me, it was like I could keep working on the traditional approach, particularly in a think tank style approach, which is you create evidence and then you advocate it. But that's not going to get the people at the top to change. And it was like, how could we actually work with the decision makers to build their capacity to be able to make long-term decisions, as opposed to us banging our heads against a brick wall working on a specific policy that is never going to get adopted. And trust me, you need a Prozac after going to a UN meeting. It's just really depressing. So for me, that really drives me, I guess, is that sense that it doesn't matter what your issue is, if it's early childhood, if it's agriculture, if it's obesity, health, whatever. It's like there's some things going on. I think we all intuitively know that, and yet at the same time we have to work in the way we've been told we have to work. And so my dream, I guess, is in 50 years' time we're going to look back and we're going to go, wow, that was the age of the sort of the machine, and we're just going to really think that was such old school thinking, the way we organised our organisations, the way we did our administration, the way we did our funding reporting, and it's going to be a whole systems thinking world, which is just going to be a bit like Age of Enlightenment. So hopefully we can build capacity in all these different organisations to actually have different ways of working, instead of us just having to work around all the ways and the reportings that we have to do at the moment, which I think most of us do. We just find ways to get around it because it just is an obstacle. And then my last point is, I guess, in relation to early childhood development, which we are actually working with some groups, including 1020 and Eracy and others, around just wanting to show leadership in that systems shift sense, I guess, of how do you actually get to some of those deeper system drivers and understand the mindsets and the ways that we're working. For me, I guess, so I actually grew up in what you would call a disadvantaged community in northwest New South Wales. I wasn't disadvantaged. I came from quite a privileged background, but I did go to a school where through high school, a lot of my friends started dropping out or getting into alcohol or, turning up with bruises or whatever else happened. And I think the other thing is we all jumped into us that we were disadvantaged. So I think it's not the best thing to get into a kid's mind that they're disadvantaged, because I think the expectations for us were not get knocked up, don't go to jail, you can get out of town when you finish year 12. So I think for me, I'd just be careful about find the advantage and disadvantage, don't just label kids. So thanks.